Morning and welcome. My name is Steve Call. I'm the president of New America, and it's my privilege to get us started today and to welcome you here. I'm really excited about what's going to unfold. Just first, a few housekeeping notes. We're webcasting live both at our website and at foreignpolicy.com. Voice of America is here, Al-Hura is here. You're on the record. So when you come to the audience participation portion of the programs as we go along and you ask a question, as I hope some of you will do, and refrain from making a speech, as I hope all of you will do wait for the microphone and identify yourself clearly and just be aware that you're on the record. It'd be a great time to remind yourself that your noisy devices should be silenced. We like to just keep moving at our events, so though we have 3 panels, we're not going to take breaks as the day goes along, formal breaks. If you need to take a break yourself, obviously just do so on your own initiative, but try to be quiet and efficient about it. We're very full today. We've got overflow rooms upstairs. If you want to take advantage of those over the course of your attendance, but please do make all the chairs available for folks who want to be in this room. I want to just offer some quick thank yous before I set the table for the panels. First, to the team that put this together at New America. It's been really a joy for my own experience at New America over the last year or so, as Peter Bergen and I have built up a little bit of a body of work in this area, our sort of counterterrorism practice, as we call it sometimes, but it's really a team now that has come together to pull events like this together. Catherine Tiedemann, Brian Fishman, who's recently joined us from West Point, Andrew Lebovich, who's here someplace, and our great interns, Kaylee, and also Patrick Doherty. And without their extraordinary energy and intellect, we wouldn't have had the quality of papers that we're releasing today. Also, I'd like to thank Foreign Policy, who are our neighbors upstairs. Susan Glasser, the editor, executive editor of Foreign Policy, will moderate the second panel, but they've been great partners of ours on the AFPAC channel, which I'm sure some of you subscribe to. That's a dedicated spot on foreignpolicy.com that delivers continuous expert commentary and information about the Afghanistan-Pakistan theater. It also includes a daily email briefing that now has 3,200 subscribers, and I would imagine that any of you who have come here today are either subscribers or want to be. So if you aren't, figure out how to do that by going to foreignpolicy.com or calling out Catherine, who's standing over there against the wall. I think you understand what we're trying to do today. I think a lot of it is just contained in the papers that we're releasing and in the papers that we're previewing, as well as in the presentations that you're hearing. This is the first in a series of events that New America is going to try to organize in partnership with Foreign Policy to do 2 things. One is to sort of map at a greater level of detail and subtlety the human, political, and sort of militant terrain along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, with an eye towards bringing forward fresh, rich, data-rich analysis and insight about the particular groups and linkages among groups that shape the conflict on both sides of the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. That's work that will unfold in a series of events like this. This is the first in effect of a series. We have another one scheduled in April, I believe, about the federally administered tribal areas and southern Afghanistan as well, to some extent, just the FATA. And we will come forward in a series of geographically defined events of that type. We also, though, at the same time as we work sort of from sector to sector in a geographical sense, we're trying as well to develop discourse and understanding about the global threat that Al-Qaeda and related groups poses, and to open discussion about the nature and severity of that threat in all of its respects, both the kinetic threat that these groups obviously continue to pose, but also related strategic issues such as their communication strategy, the effectiveness of that strategy, countermeasures, and other related issues. And you'll hear a lot of that today as we talk about Al-Qaeda Central. We've got 3 excellent panels and a very exciting body of rising scholars and experts about this subject to hear from today, and I'll let each of the moderators introduce the particular panelists. But I think what brings them together is an extraordinarily detailed grasp of what Al-Qaeda Central and its immediate offshoots are up to, what they represent, how they're structured, how they do and do not connect to other groups and to individuals who are operating in the West and in the United States. And as you can see from your own schedule, we'll start with a broader assessment, a general threat assessment that'll be informed by 2 outstanding scholars of Al-Qaeda over the last 10 or 15 years. And then we will move into a sense of location along the border, the current contest between the United States and its allies and Al-Qaeda waged by drone and other means. And then we'll talk in the end, as I come back up, about strategic communications. And those of you who haven't read the work of Dan Kimmage and Josh Geltzer, really 2 young scholars who are making a huge difference in the way we think about strategic communications in relationship to Al-Qaeda, but also related groups in South Asia. So that's enough from me, and I will now welcome to the stage Peter Bergen, who will take us forward with the first panel. Thanks for being here this morning.
So thank you very much, Steve. Thank you for coming today. So our first panel is going to be Paul Cruikshank and Barbara Sood. Paul is an alumni fellow of NYU Center on Northern Security, a graduate of Cambridge and also of SAIS, currently working on a series for CNN on the American domestic threat, and has done a very, very powerful paper on the kind of pipeline between the West and the Fatah and what that means for our national security. And also, it's a great pleasure, I think this is Barbara Sood's first public presentation. Barbara is a 3-decade veteran of the agency, one of the leading experts on Al-Qaeda in the U.S. government. She has a PhD from Princeton in medieval Arabic thought, something rather obscure when she did it in the late 70s, but now, of course, a rather useful study. And she has done a paper, a very useful paper, on kind of where Al-Qaeda Central is today. So we'll start with Paul, and then Barbara will speak next. And they're both going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it to about half an hour of questions. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank Peter and Steve and the entire New America team for organizing this event today. I'm very happy to be here, and it's a real privilege to be on this panel with Barbara Sood, who has such expertise and experience in all the issues we're going to be discussing today. Barbara, I think in a little while, is going to present a top-down analysis, an overview of the Al-Qaeda threat emanating from the Pakistan-Afghanistan region. What I'm going to try and do, and what I've done in the paper, is to build up a bottom-up account of Al-Qaeda's safe haven there through the accounts of Western militants who've traveled to the region in the last 6-7 years, who've come back, been arrested, and their interrogation reports, testimony at trial, statements to prosecutors have really shed some fascinating light on the Al-Qaeda safe haven, on the militant pipeline that takes people over there. Now, the conclusion that I have is that Pakistan, that border region, is an extremely high national security concern for the United States and Western countries. this is not an opinion which everybody has in the field. There's been considerable debate amongst the terrorism experts about whether homegrown autonomous groups acting independently from Al-Qaeda present a greater danger, or whether the greater danger comes from Al-Qaeda Central in Pakistan. Mark Sageman, for example, has emphasized the threat which has come from autonomous homegrown plots in an exhaustive study of terrorism cases of just plots in the West in the last several years. He found that 80% of these plots in the last between 2004 and 2008 were entirely homegrown, that they had no link to Al-Qaeda. So what I did in preparing this paper is really to sort of focus in on this. What is the link between Pakistan and the terrorism plots in the West? And what I wanted to do is really focus on the serious terrorist plots, not just all the terrorist plots like Mark Sageman has done, but the serious terrorist plots. And let me just get to this PowerPoint. And by focusing on the serious terrorist plots, and I came up with some objective criteria here, the attacks that kill more than 10 people, the attacks which had devices not malfunction would have killed more than 10 people, and plots where you have cell members acquiring bomb-making components or weapons in which they can actually carry out the plots. If you look at those plots, and if you really zero in on those plots, you get some very, very interesting results. And you see that Pakistan looms much, much larger as a connection in these plots. 52% of people have in these serious terrorist plots have actually gone to Pakistan. There are 52% of the cases in these plots linked to Pakistan. Let me just show this a bit graphically. So, looking at the operational direction in these plots, you get 38% of these plots linked operationally to Pakistan. Now, this is quite a significant number, and it shows the relevance of Al-Qaeda's training areas in the Pakistan region. If you look at the training, you see an even greater relationship to Pakistan. You see 52% of these cases. Some of the plotters have gone and trained in Pakistan. So if you really zero in on the serious terrorism plots in the West between 2004 and 2009, you see the tribal areas of Pakistan as being a big part of this story. Now, training in all these plots is very, very important because when people are sort of thinking about launching terrorist attacks, it's very, very sort of difficult for them to make bombs by just downloading instructions off the internet. You need quite a lot of training and expertise in order to make these devices where you can launch these attacks. In the West, and this has very much been reflected in the trial testimony in a lot of these plots, where plotters themselves have talked about needing to go to Pakistan to actually acquire the sort of bomb-making training that Al-Qaeda can provide over there. Now, if you're looking at the sort of link between the tribal areas of Pakistan and these serious terrorism plots over the years, you've seen very much that Britain, in the years after 9/11, was the country most affected, was the country where there was this greatest threat from Pakistan. That was for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was there was a great amount of Al-Qaeda support in the UK. There's a large Pakistani diaspora community there. There's a great travel flow from the UK to Pakistan, about 400,000 people traveling from the UK to Pakistan every year. And there was also the presence of a facilitation network in the UK taking people from the UK to Pakistan getting terrorist training over there. In the years after 9/11, people from the continent of Europe, they weren't really going to Pakistan so much as going to Iraq. There were few Americans who were traveling to Pakistan. It was very much the UK in these initial years after 9/11 where you saw the travel flows to Pakistan to get this terrorist training. You saw a series of plots in the UK. In 2004, Deer and Barot plotted an attack in the UK using sort of gas canisters in limousines. You saw a plot also in 2004 with people who wanted to blow up devices with fertilizer. You saw the 7/7 attacks. You saw the airline plot in 2006, which is by far the most serious terrorist plot since 9/11. All these plots had a link to Al-Qaeda. The plotters all went and trained with Al-Qaeda, and you had some very, very serious plots, and obviously on 7/7 an attack got through. Now, around 2006, you started seeing more Europeans going to the tribal areas of Pakistan. It had previously been Brits, and now more Europeans started going across. The Iraq War sort of dried up as a cause célèbre for recruits from Europe, and more of them started going off towards Pakistan. And you saw a series of plots in Europe emerging with links to the Pakistan region. You saw in 2007 a plot in Denmark. Hamid Khurshid, a Danish recruit who went to Pakistan, trained with Al-Qaeda in North Waziristan. You saw a group of Germans travel in 2006 and train with the Islamic Jihad Union, an Uzbek group affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And in 2008, in January, there was a plot where a number of residents of Barcelona traveled to Pakistan, linked up with the Pakistani Taliban, and plotted an attack. In recent years, the most alarming rise of militants traveling from Europe to Pakistan has been in Germany. You've seen maybe 80, 90 militants going from Germany to Pakistan in recent years. A lot of them have hooked up with two groups, the Islamic Jihad Union and the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. And the Islamic Jihad Union in particular has plotted a number of attacks in the West in recent years. There's real palpable concern in Germany about this group. In the last 2 years, you've had a greater sort of number of Americans now travel to the tribal areas of Pakistan. So sort of Brits after 9/11, then continental Europeans, and now Americans. In the last 2 years, there have been at least half a dozen Americans who've traveled to the tribal areas of Pakistan. They've included Bryant Neal Venus, Nigel Bulazazi, and two friends of his, David Headley, and several others have traveled to this region for alleged terrorist training. There's real concern now about those travel flows. There's a large Pakistani diaspora community in the United States, and there's a problem in recent years of increased radicalization in the US, the greater number of Americans sort of supporting Al-Qaeda. And that means that it's likely that more people will try and go to the tribal areas of Pakistan and get training over there. So that's really just an introduction to talk about the paper. The paper looks at 5 case studies of Western militants who've travelled from the West to Pakistan, to the tribal areas, to northwest Pakistan to get training in the last 6-7 years. And by looking at these studies, you really get sort of snapshots in time of the nature of that safe haven, the nature of the safe haven in the year after 9/11 and the years following. The first case that I looked at was the case of the fertilizer bombers. This is a group of British recruits who travelled to Pakistan shortly after 9/11. They were mainly based in Lahore. And they wanted most of them to go and fight in Afghanistan. But during that process, Al-Qaeda sort of managed to persuade them to sort of turn around, come back and launch attacks in Britain using fertilizer bombs. There's some very interesting documents coming out of that trial. Mohammed Junaid Babar, an American linked to the group, testified in the trial in the UK. There was also a very long confession from one of the plotters, Sahaluddin Amin, and they really provide a fascinating snapshot of what the tribal areas, what northwestern Pakistan were like at that point. And it was very, very different from what that area of the world, it was very, very different from what Al-Qaeda safe haven was like in Afghanistan, in the sense that the camps were very much smaller, everything was much more ad hoc, they had to organize all their training. When they did get training, they weren't trained by Al-Qaeda operatives, but by freelance trainers, by Taliban, and they basically, it was sort of do-it-yourself terrorist training with some contact with Al-Qaeda. That was the sort of snapshot that cell provided. But in the years that followed, what you saw was that Al-Qaeda's safe haven deepened in the tribal areas of Pakistan for a number of reasons. The Pakistani military in 2004 went in with some very heavy-handed operations. There was a sort of backlash against that, a radicalization of the Pashtun tribes in the area. There was also a sort of series of hollow peace agreements between 2004 and 2006, which strengthened the hand of the militants in the region. And the sort of terrorism cases that follow in the West, where you have this testimony coming from Western recruits, you see descriptions of a much safer haven for Al-Qaeda in that period. Between 2005 and 2007, a group of British recruits went there, a group of German recruits went there, and a Dane went there to the tribal areas of Pakistan. And there have been descriptions coming from those cases of what that safe haven was like. And in all of these cases, the training was now happening much deeper inside FATA. It wasn't with freelancers, but it was with Al-Qaeda bomb makers. And Al-Qaeda was able to sort of exert much more command and control over these plots than they had been before. You see Al-Qaeda sort of rebuilding its operations in the tribal areas of Pakistan compared to what they'd been like in, say, 2003, 2004. So all these Western cases, you'll see it in the paper, sort of demonstrate that there was a sort of evolution in the safe haven, the tribal areas of Pakistan, that Al-Qaeda is feeling more confident in the years leading up to around 2008. Now, in 2008, something new happens, which is a dramatic escalation in the drone campaign in the tribal areas, and there's a great paper from Peter Bergen and Catherine Tiedemann on this. And the Western recruits who were there at the time described this drone campaign as very effective, that it was creating a lot of concern to Al-Qaeda. They were moving around Western recruits from place to place, trying to prevent them from being targeted by these strikes, that Al-Qaeda really had to whole-scale adapt its operation and organizational structures in the tribal areas of Pakistan. There are about 7 militants who traveled during this period from Belgium and France. There was also an American, Bryant Neal Venus, who traveled in this period, 2008. And both these groups, Venus and the Belgian-French group, have provided interrogators fascinating and detailed accounts of the nature of Al-Qaeda's safe haven in 2008, and how Al-Qaeda really, faced by this crisis, this escalation in the drone campaign, was able to adapt. To successfully adapt, to decentralize its operations, to change the way it ran things in the tribal areas Pakistan. Rather than have people training outside, they started making people train indoors. They relied from then on exclusively on couriers for communication. They didn't use any more electronic communications in the area. And the training was also indoors. It was in small kind of dwellings in the mountainside rather than in valleys. And within those dwellings, they were able to offer still very sophisticated training. So the drone campaign had not affected al-Qaeda's ability to train Western recruits in the sort of bomb making that would be useful to launch terrorist operations in the West. And just wrapping up, what do we know about what has happened since 2008? Well, in 2009, there have been sort of no cases so far, terrorism cases linked back to Pakistan. And there have been very few eyewitness accounts of what the tribal areas are like. There has been an expansion in the drone campaign. There's been a new offensive in South Waziristan. But I don't think this has really wiped out al-Qaeda. I think it's pretty likely you'll see new plots emerging from the tribal areas of Pakistan. And when you're really thinking about, well, what is the danger from those tribal areas, from northwestern Pakistan, I think you can just compare the sort of state of that safe haven now in 2010 to 2005 and 2006, when al-Qaeda trained a group of at least, I think, about 7 of the airline plotters went and trained in North Waziristan in 2005, 2006. Well, since then, the number of Western recruits to the tribal areas has only gone up. And the bomb makers are still very much present on the ground. They've been dislodged perhaps from South Waziristan, but they're still in North Waziristan, where al-Qaeda trained the airline plotters. And so I don't think a lot really has changed between 2005-06 and 2010. There's still a significant threat which comes from the tribal areas of Pakistan, and not just from al-Qaeda. And as you'll see from the paper, in recent years, there have perhaps been more recruits who have joined jihadist groups affiliated with al-Qaeda, allied to al-Qaeda, rather than al-Qaeda itself. Groups like the Pakistani Taliban, the Islamic Jihad Union, which is an Uzbek group, and Lashkar al-Toiba, have all sort of boosted their Western recruits and have in recent years started to target the West, just like al-Qaeda has done, partly out of a greater ideological affinity for what al-Qaeda is trying to do, but also to boost their prestige and recruiting capabilities. So I think that where we are now with the terrorist threat from Pakistan is in a place where there's still a significant threat. It may have gone down, it may have been degraded because of the drone campaign and some Pakistani military operations, but it's still there. The last 6 years have shown that a majority of people, the majority of the cases, serious cases in the West, you've seen this link back to Pakistan. And so I think that there ought to be still significant concern about the tribal areas of Pakistan, about that terrorist safe haven. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank the New America Foundation, Peter and Steve and Catherine, for inviting me to speak. Since I was working in the government before, I was told not to talk to journalists, and now I've had to do quite a bit of talking to journalists. I'd like to follow on from what Paul was saying. Sometimes you feel a little apologetic that you're still kind of defending al-Qaeda, that aren't they weakened? You're kind of a little embarrassed about that. And, you know, are you still this old line thinker that's still with the old ways? Because there are strong counter-arguments. The group has been hit hard by the drones. People will tell you bin Laden's just a symbol now. He's just a figurehead. And then you look at their attacks, the Christmas bombing attempt. Now, didn't that show Al-Qaeda Central was weak? and depended on its quote-unquote franchises. Then you'll get those that say, well, okay, but there's this global movement, and it's going to carry on their thinking, their ideology. And then there's those homegrown terrorists that Paul was referring to, homegrown. So we need to do a rigorous assessment of Al-Qaeda in the situation now. At its core, the group headquartered in the tribal regions and along the Afghan border. And it's difficult because we don't have all the information we need. And rigorous analysis may be almost impossible. So when I was asked to look into this, I had to draw from the relatively few bits and pieces that are known and the group's past track record. And I used as a basis for comparison the national intelligence estimate that the Director of National Intelligence put out in 2007, which had, quote, that Al-Qaeda had protected or regenerated key elements of its homeland attack capability, including a safe haven in the Pakistan federally administered tribal areas, operational lieutenants, and its top leadership. So I wanted to examine Al-Qaeda's core strength. What is its leadership? How are its key lieutenants? And does it still have a safe haven? Now, the main obstacles to evaluating Al-Qaeda's overall command strength are that it's a clandestine organization, and it's one that's relatively small. Bin Laden and Zawahiri have kept themselves relatively secluded, except for press statements, since 2001, popping up only sporadically. And if these men are involved in daily activities, they also surely rely on the upper middle ranks below them, their operational commanders, to accomplish their work. And these middle ranks appear to have suffered the most from the UAV strikes, from what we can see. People like Abu Khabab, the poisons and WMD so-called expert, Abu Layth, an operational commander, Hussein al-Kini, who was a veteran of the campaign against the embassies in Africa. So one might assume that they would be able to be replaced only with difficulty and perhaps by people of lesser talents. But you can't assume that. First of all, you don't know who all the candidates are to replace them and how many there are. And we've seen relatively obscure people like Khalid Habib, now deceased, who weren't lacking in jihadist experience. And we can also say that anybody who comes in now, or someone who moves up now, is well aware of the dangers facing them, so they're really committed to the cause. And then when you look at most wanted lists, you might be checking off who's gone. And we used to hear that President Bush had something in his desk drawer where he'd whip it out and check off. Those lists were limited for convenience. You're not going to give a policymaker a whole long list of everybody you know about, just the key people. And they wouldn't include anybody that hadn't yet popped up on the radar screen. And then you have to look at how Al-Qaeda is organized. There's been a great deal of academic and journalist interest in Al-Qaeda, the movement, in the past few years, the ideological stream. And that sometimes diverts attention from Al-Qaeda, the organization. And we know from documents that were captured after 9/11 that Al-Qaeda wanted to be very organized. Now, I'm not saying they're completely competent all the time, but they wanted to be a base for global jihad. They wanted to have people in certain command positions. They were thinking of having an army, or at least fostering armies. And so those documents show they have rules for succession. There's the Emir, the commander, Bin Laden, his deputy, now Ayman al-Zawahiri, and they have rules. There'll be a vote by the Shura Council, and they'll move up. Someone will move up to replace them. Now, would that really happen? But that may be what we're seeing in the lower ranks. We saw Abu Hafs who died in 2001. He replaced Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, who had died in a drowning accident in Lake Victoria in Africa. And then we saw more recently Mustafa Abu Yazid seems to have taken over from Abu Faraj al-Libi when he was arrested in 2005. And the losses didn't stop operations for long. If you look at the London transit bombings, they took place right after Abu Faraj was arrested. He was arrested in May. The bombings take place in July as planned. If you look at who's left, you seem to still have bin Laden and Zawahiri. I listened to the radio this morning to make sure we hadn't gotten bin Laden yet. And, you have kind of mixed feelings. If they do get him, Peter, how would you feel if they got him? I had a colleague who was a Zarqawi analyst, and she had to put Zarqawi analyst currently unemployed. And I think that bin Laden and Zawahiri still have an operational role. And last October, General Petraeus told NBC News that bin Laden retained a degree of operational importance. Oh, it's always difficult to tell exactly what that is. But we know he had a habit of sometimes being really hands-on, like selecting the hijackers for the 9/11 attempt. And other times he lets, okay, I trust the people below me. But you can see in their statements in 2008, in March and April, bin Laden and then Zawahiri threatened Denmark. And that was followed by the bombing of the Danish embassy in Islamabad in June. And it was also confirmed by General Manager Abu Yazid that they had in fact conducted that attack. And that's another position that when you see Mustafa Abu Yazid, he's the number 3, and some of the statements by U.S. officials recently appear to confirm that. Although he's said to be commander for Afghanistan, the fact that he's called al-Mas'ul al-Am, which has been the title was used by Abu Hafs and Abu Faraj, that seems to be the number 3 position, kind of general official or general manager. And then among the senior ranks, we still don't have a full picture. We see Abu Yahya al-Libi giving speeches, and Atiyah Abdurrahman, and there may be others that are up there still. So we're probably seeing below them, people are moving up as well. But the real test is whether they're still conducting business as usual. Can they perform their core functions? Preparing for operations by planning, recruiting, and training. And we just heard Paul here saying that yes, they are still training, although it's difficult to get information about the past year, 2009, where the people we're seeing popping up today were mainly trained in 2008. And they've certainly been disseminating propaganda at a rapid clip and attempting attacks, whether it was via Yemen in the case of the Christmas bombing or via the Central, it's sometimes hard to tell. But in my view, they're able to continue this, and they're able to do it with relative impunity because they can still count on that safe haven in Pakistan's tribal areas and perhaps within Afghanistan. The Pakistani military pressure in past years was not sustained enough to root out the group. And they were able to easily regroup and move around in the region and have become increasingly embedded within the local scene. For example, as Paul mentioned, in 2004, they were driven out of South Waziristan, but they moved north. And then later on, as they developed ties to the Massoud, they could move back into south and be in both south, north, Bajaur, and further. And they also have maintained ties with Punjab-based militants who were involved in the Kashmir effort. For example, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi helped them escape from Afghanistan in 2001. And more recently, they have cemented ties with the Huji and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. And many of these people also have ties to urban areas such as Lahore, which might allow them to move out. I noticed that Vinya said that he came into Lahore where he was recruited. And it remains to be seen yet whether the current round, which seems to be really strong counterterrorism pressured by the Pakistanis, will change that pattern. Then there's Afghanistan. I don't think Al-Qaeda has given up on getting back into Afghanistan, having that as a safe haven, whatever its relationship might be with the current Taliban leaders. There's too much of an historical attachment from the Soviet war period, where bin Laden had his greatest exploits, and bin Laden may have owned property there, according to his son in the book Growing Up Bin Laden. And whatever the on-again, off-again relationship is with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda seems to believe it will return. And it appears to be anticipating that with attacks, at least at a minor level there. Maybe one guy blew himself up near a base and it fizzled, and then we have the attack on CIA personnel. Whatever the number of people there, and the National Security Advisor mentioned 100 or less, for Al-Qaeda it's a relatively small organization, so 100 or less might be a core to start something. The bottom line is what we've been seeing. They're still trying to attack U.S. interests in Afghanistan, Pakistan region, and elsewhere, including trying to mount something within the United States, as we saw at least with the Zazi case, and who knows what they had to do with the Yemen, sending the Nigerian guy here for the Detroit attempt. And so they've been unsuccessful so far. But historically, they have come back again and again to the same target list. And this includes recruiting people who could operate in the U.S. and other Western countries, or attempting to send people in from outside, and they have focused on destroying aircraft. We had Richard Reed with the shoe bomb attempt, the 2006 aviation plot, now maybe this Christmas 2009 plot. And then, in addition to U.S. targets, they're also making Muslim countries, direct U.S. targets, rather than making Muslim countries inhospitable to American interests as much as they can, Afghanistan and Pakistan in particular, because they believe they can outlast any U.S. commitment to those countries. How long will the U.S. be willing to sacrifice? And they believe it's a short time. Now, they've been wrong. They were wrong in Iraq. They were wrong. They may be wrong in Afghanistan. But they know there are pressures on U.S. and Western interests to just call it a halt to it and leave. And Al-Qaeda retains kind of core wing elements in certain countries, such as the Arabian Peninsula, with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, East Africa, where you still have Harun Fazul, although Nabhan was killed. And they have these ties to AQIM are long-standing. They've had a lot of North Africans in the group, and so even though there's a great distance between the core Al-Qaeda and the North Africans, there's probably a really close relationship. But they are vulnerable now. They are very vulnerable. They do benefit from their safe haven. Yes, they can operate without a good safe haven, but it's not as good. So will the counterterrorism pressure on them be relentless enough to restrain them? Have they made mistakes? Have they put too much faith in the TTP, Tariq-i-Taliban, Pakistani Taliban types, and are going down with them? Are they spread out enough into other areas to make up for that? And how alienated is the group from the Taliban, from the Afghan Taliban? Will they be sold down the river by Mullah Omar and not be able to return to their favorite spot, Afghanistan? And will Al-Qaeda leaders have to go on the move? And we know when they've been in cities before, such as after 2001, they were picked up more easily. So are they putting themselves at risk? To me, they haven't been wiped out yet. They still have capabilities, and it remains to be seen how long they'll last. Thank you.
Great. So we have time for about 15 minutes plus of questions. If you have a question, we're going to get a mic to you, and also can you identify yourself and your affiliation? Wow, no questions. That's a first. Go.
Hello, I'm Helen Raffel, Resources for the Future, and I've worked in 3 Muslim countries. I'm wondering why it would or would not really be in Pakistan's interest to obliterate the Al-Qaeda and Taliban from their mountainous regions, and are they so focused on India that they want to sort of balance off the good wishes of America by making little gestures, but they don't really care about whether Al-Qaeda remains on their territory?
Well, I can't claim to be an expert on Pakistan, so I'll say that right off the bat. But from looking at their relationship with Al-Qaeda and their counterterrorism activities in the past, it looks like there's still a very strong strain on India, that they believe India's behind things. Though they've had talks with India, and so it's been more on an even keel, but they're very suspicious based on past events. But we also have seen the Pakistani Taliban attacking military and government targets. So there's a potential there that they are more determined. And then also the SWAT episode where so many civilians were affected. And on top of that, they appear to have a concern that the U.S. will start going after targets outside the tribal areas. And they don't want that to happen, so they are taking a more concerted view against these militants. Anybody else?
I think there's been a sort of quantum shift in the public opinion in Pakistan that people are very much turned against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The support for them has really plummeted in recent years as you've had more operations from the Taliban, Pakistani Taliban, against targets in Pakistan proper. So you do have this change, but there is still this long-term strategic calculation which India plays into, as Barbara was referencing.
Just to pick up, I think that the biggest strategic shift that we've seen since 9/11 is the changing view of the Pakistani military, public, and government, as Paul and Barbara have indicated. Support for suicide bombing has dropped from 33% to 5% in the last several years. The SWAT operation in 2009 was done with the majority support of the Pakistani population. The South Waziristan operation we've just seen, 51% of Pakistanis are in favor of it. Previous operations in exactly the same areas were seen as done simply for the Americans. In fact, the first Waziristan operation coincided with the arrival in Islamabad of Secretary Powell in 2004. So these were sort of performance art operations by the Pakistanis and not serious. This has changed completely for all very obvious reasons, very similar to what happened in Saudi Arabia, which is the Pakistani Taliban have made a major strategic error, which is attacking where they live. Just as Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia made a major strategic error. So I think going forward, this is probably the most, since Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are headquartered in Pakistan, this is the biggest change we've seen since 9/11. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Benjamin Tour from the Council for the National Interest. A two-part question. Barbara Suda, you said that Al-Qaeda thinks it can outlast the U.S. in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and they were wrong in Iraq. Could you say something about the role of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and its presence before and after the U.S. invasion? And the other part is the recruitment pool for Al-Qaeda increasing or decreasing? And anybody can answer the second part.
I cannot comment on the situation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq prior to 9/11. I am under certain restrictions as a former intelligence community analyst and would have to get that cleared, and I have not. However, you were asking about it afterwards as well, or?
Well, yes, and you can rely on unclassified sources for your judgment on the first part.
Unclassified sources would indicate there was not much of a presence. I would have always wanted to say if there's a jihad, an official jihad starts up, which would be against a Western invasion, then, or any invasion from a foreign power, then it would draw people to it. But to look at them now, I see that it looks like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and I haven't been working on that, is reduced to a small area, but we see some attacks that could be attributable to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, such as the attacks on Baghdad government facilities. And the other part was the recruitment pool.
Yes.
That's hard to say because we see some polling that indicates decreasing interest in Al-Qaeda, in Al-Qaeda's message on the part of many Muslims. But they don't need a lot. It's a small organization, so if they can get some of these people that Paul was talking about, then that might be sufficient for them to still conduct attacks where they want to do them. Paul?
Yeah, just sort of adding to that, on the recruitment side, in the last several years what we've seen is a wide-scale backlash against Al-Qaeda in Muslim communities around the world. The polling support for them has collapsed, the support for suicide bombing has collapsed. An aspect of that has been former jihadist allies of Al-Qaeda who fought with them in Afghanistan turning against Al-Qaeda. We've seen that in Saudi Arabia, we've seen that in Egypt, recently in Libya and Mauritania and Morocco. In Britain, people who once joined Al-Qaeda are now sort of campaigning against them on the streets of London and other cities in the UK. And all this has a significant effect. But you also got the problem that it doesn't take many of these radicals to cause large-scale carnage, as we saw on 9/11, we potentially saw with the airline plot in 2006. And so if just a few are going over to Pakistan to get that training which can make them into dangerous terrorists, then you've still got a significant problem. There may be now more people going from the West to Pakistan than there have been ever before. In 2009, you had about maybe 150, according to officials, make the trip. So there's significant concern about that, but it's sort of country to country that there is a sort of difference. I think in the UK, officials believe that maybe less people are now going to the tribal areas of Pakistan for training. But in the United States, there's more concern now than there has been in several years. And in one country in particular, there is alarm, and that country is Germany, where you've seen dozens and dozens of recruits going from Germany in the last several years, joining up with mainly Uzbek groups, also the Pakistani Taliban, and getting terrorist training there and coming back in significant numbers. So it's difficult to know the exact numbers, but it doesn't take many to launch very significant terrorist strikes.
Hello, Samira Daniels with Ramsey Decisions. Mr. Cruikshank, is it?
Cruikshank.
Okay. Could you list in the 133 terrorist serious threats, what sort of reasons, I don't know if you know Urdu or Punjabi or Arabic, whatever, what you think are the 3 or 4, if there are 3 or 4 reasons why these terrorist threats or terrorist acts are occurring in your judgment or in your research?
Well, I found 21 serious plots against the West in the years between 2004 and 2009. Variety of different people involved in those plots, recruited for different reasons. Some were entirely homegrown. Some had strong links back to Al-Qaeda or other jihadist groups. I think a dominant theme in a lot of these plots was anger over American foreign policy, particularly caused by the war in Iraq, anger over some of the controversial aspects of that war on terrorism, Abu Ghraib, and Guantanamo. One of the German recruits in the Sauerland cell, which was a group that traveled to Germany in 2006, was personal friends with Khalid al-Masri, a guy who was basically kidnapped by the CIA in Germany, and sort of in an extraordinary rendition. And that for him was his motivation. Some of them wanted to go just for adventure. They wanted to go to Afghanistan to sort of fight the glorious fight, to be heroes, to get away from their drab existence as they may have seen it in the West. And then in the tribal areas of Pakistan, in the Al-Qaeda camps, something seems to happen, that people who want to go and fight in Afghanistan are turned around and persuaded to become suicide bombers in the West. And just in the last few days, we saw a plea agreement from Najib al-Azazi, an American Al-Qaeda recruit, where he said that the reason he went to the camps was so that he could get to Afghanistan and fight there against Americans, and was then turned around and persuaded to do something in New York against subways.
Over here. And then in back, Catherine.
Mumtaz, I'm a freelance journalist. From what I understand, you say that Al-Qaeda, I mean, it seems that Al-Qaeda is still able to train in a very centralized way in their safe havens in the tribal area, despite all of the efforts of the US and its allies to kind of wipe them out. What do you think still needs to be done to really hamper their training capabilities and to really deal them a very important blow?
I can start. I think it's difficult to eliminate it because we're not seeing a big training camp anymore. So that would be something that might have been able to be attacked or overrun. But they can work in a building, in a compound, and somebody's in a very small area. Especially learning how to use explosives. If they don't detonate them often enough, and maybe they're not because they're having some trouble with them. You do need hands-on people who've studied explosives, so you cannot just learn it off the internet usually. But I think that's the hard part. It's because it's just small scale.
I think that, just to add to that, the biggest policy priority is to do something about these safe havens. As I referenced earlier, 52% of serious cases you have a training or directional link to Pakistan. Clearly that's a real significant problem. North Waziristan has emerged in recent years as the ground zero for terrorist plots against the West. 4 or 5 of the serious plots have links to that part of the world. Especially near the town of Mir Ali, they have a lot of training facilities there, which are just small shacks, of course. So you need to do something about North Waziristan. They control the ground, the pro-Al-Qaeda militants right now, and the bomb makers are still there, and the recruits are still going in, and the danger remains.
My guess is also the Pakistani military may well move into northern Waziristan over the next several months. We're going to take one more question, and then we're going to table you can ask other questions in the next panels. So in the back, Andrew.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm Meredith Buell from Voice of America, former Islamabad bureau chief. Question for all 3 panelists to follow exactly what you were just talking about, and that is the issue of North Waziristan. It's no secret the Pakistani intelligence community has a very close relationship with the Haqqani family and those who are living in North Waziristan, called by U.S. military officials in Afghanistan their most dangerous enemy in the region. How do you get the Pakistani military to go into North Waziristan? How do you convince them that that is in the best interests of Pakistan, since everybody is saying that that is the ground zero for Al-Qaeda?
Well, the best person to answer this is in the front row here, which is Steve Cole, since he is the historian of that relationship. I don't think that's a very easy question to answer, to be honest. I don't think there is an obvious answer. Jalaluddin Haqqani, after all, the father of the Haqqanis, has been an asset of the Pakistani government, arguably since the 1982. That's a very long relationship. Barbara.
Yeah, I don't really have anything more because it would be Pakistani motives, Pakistani government motives, and I'm not really up on that. And also whatever their personal ties were with some of these people.
One of the interesting things with the tribal areas is the tribes themselves and the degree to which they really do support Al-Qaeda and the foreign militants. The Pakistani Taliban and the Haqqani network do protect these militants. But some people sort of who are familiar with the area talk about a sort of silent majority, a very silent majority perhaps, of just normal clansmen from the Masud and Waziri tribes who are sort of bothered by the presence of these militants and just want to get on with their daily lives. They're sort of, over the last decades, they've been involved in quite lucrative smuggling and racketeering and all this sort of stuff. And having all these foreign militants there is rather a hindrance to some of these profit-making activities. So whether there is an opportunity to drive a wedge between normal tribesmen, so to speak, and the militants, that's an interesting question.
And then I think you'd have to also include the Afghan border would have to be blocked, and it have to be, because the Haqqani's home turf is in coast, I understand. And so you'd have to make sure they couldn't just abscond across the border.
Thank you very much.